Greetings my chess friends, and once again welcome to this little chess video. And in it we're going to discuss backwards pawns. And backward pawn is simply a pawn that cannot move forward because of lack of mobility. And you can see in this instance that the pawn here on b2 is backwards, and not only does it lack mobility, but it can be prey along the half-open file to other pieces. Now usually one side possessing a backward pawn has problems defending it. But not only is the pawn weak in itself, the squares in front of it are also weak. And enemy pieces can guard up and put pressure on this backward pawn. So it provides an excellent opportunity to pressurize it with your heavy pieces. Not only is the pawn weak in itself, but the square in front of a backwards pawn is also exceptionally weak. And we can see that in this position here. The d6 square sits in front of this backwards pawn here on d7. And it's an excellent place for our pieces. For simply put, they cannot be attacked along the file. So we could easily put a rook here on this weak square d6, and we can continue to put pressure on this backwards pawn. Moves like bishop to a4. And the effect of this is that our opponent's pieces are tied down to defending the weakness. And the result of it is that his pieces are deprived of mobility all over the chessboard. Now what if a backward pawn has appeared in our position? Well, first of all, we should try to get rid of it. For example, we could try to advance it forward or to exchange it for an opponent's pawn. But if we decide to protect it, we must try and do so in a way that our pieces do not turn into passive defenders, because passivity in chess is absolutely detrimental to the health of your chess army. And sometimes it's simply better to sacrifice a backward pawn so that our pieces have mobility, rather than try to cling on to it, so that we're left without any type of counterplay whatsoever. But the best way to deal with a backward pawn is simply not to create any in the first place. Simply avoid it. Now it's somewhat difficult to achieve, but nonetheless it's worth striving for. And we should be doubly careful when we are moving our pawns. But now we're going to consider following games on this topic, and they are very instructive indeed. Okay, here we have a game, Peter Korzubov with white pieces, and Olga Alexandrova with the black pieces. And it highlights essentially how to organize pressure on a backward pawn by means of heavy pieces. And the game was played in 1996 in Minsk. The black's last move was knight to c6. And if you take a look at the board, you can see that there are essentially two backward pawns. White has a backward pawn on c3, and black has a backward pawn on b6. Now, if black was allowed, he would move she would move her rook to b8 and advance this pawn, of course, to b5. And therefore, in order to stop that, white uses a very typical idea. He simply blockades the pawn. with the move a4. And he fixes this pawn on b6. And of course, as we know from our studies, anything that is immobile on the chessboard, anything that lacks mobility, cannot move, is an easier target, because after all, it's much easier to hit a stationary target than it is a moving one. Now if we put this pawn back, you may be wondering what is wrong with queen takes b6. For example, like this. Winning the backward pawn will simply put, black can of course win his pawn back with a better position after a move like rook to b8. Queen is forced to a6. Rook b3 gets played. And if the pawn tries to escape with a move like c4, simply d takes c4, queen takes c4, and rook takes a3. And black has this outside passed pawn here. And he can get good play simply by, she can get good play simply by advancing it. So that's why queen b6 was not a terribly good move. So we just go back to our position. And of course, Peter Korzubov played a4 instead, as we've discussed, fixing this weakness here. And here black evaluates the position and comes to the conclusion that although the pawn on c3 is backward, there's no real way at this point in time to create a threat against it. White has too many resources to defend his pawn and can simply advance it anyhow. So what happens is that white, Olga, she turns to a kind of passive defense of this weakness here. And as we've already discussed, passivity in chess can be absolutely detrimental to the health of your position. But this is in fact what transpires. She plays rook to b8. We've already discussed it would be a good idea for white to try and advance this c4 pawn, but it's not possible at present. Simply put, if the pawn advances and after d takes, for example, then this pawn here can come under attack. So it takes preparation for white to be able to do that. And he does that with the move rook to d1. And if this knight should ever depart from c6, then c4 certainly becomes a reality. And this pawn here can advance and become a monster pawn. Bishop to f8 was played. And this is a very instructive move, queen to b5. This move does two things. First of all, he blockades this pawn of black in order to pressurize it with heavy pieces along the b file. And the queen also takes aim at this other weakness of black, the isolated d pawn on d5. Now, if we go back just for a moment, you might be wondering why a move like c4 is not good in this position. Well, simply put, because after d takes c4, queen takes c4, knight b4, then this pawn here comes under attack and needs protecting. And after white protects this weakness on a4, black will have time to blockade the d pawn and prevent it advancing from d4 to d5. So this is the reason why c4 wasn't played immediately. And instead, white played the excellent queen to b5. We should really take note of this position because it's rather telling. Both white's heavy pieces, the queen and the rook, are engaged in protecting weak pawns. And her position, sadly for Olga Alexandrova, her pieces become passive. Rook b7 gets played. Rook b1, h6, h3, queen e6, queen a6, and queen d7. And this backwards pawn here on b6 is essentially dead. His life on the chessboard is over. No longer shall he live with his dreams of becoming a queen. He's found himself backward on a half-open b-file with the Ice Maiden on a6 and a hungry rook on b1 bearing down upon him. And Peter played, of course, rook takes b6. And this positional advantage has transformed itself, of course, into a material one. Rook takes b6, queen takes b6, bishop a3, and bishop to e1. And now white prepares for the advancement of the c-pawn, getting rid of its own weakness. Bishop goes back. Queen b5 was played. King to h7, and it's very difficult, of course, for Olga in this position. I mean, essentially what can she do? And here white played with impunity the move c4, getting rid of his weak c-pawn. Queen c7 was played. You might be wondering what happens if d takes c. Well, let's have a look. D takes c, d5, hitting the knight, knight to b8, and queen takes b8. Where else could the knight go? Of course, a move like knight d8 was impossible because of queen takes. It's a very cramped and bad position, and this is the reason why d takes c was not played. And instead, queen c7 was played. C takes d5, knight a7, queen takes a5, queen to b7, d6, knight c6, queen b5, and Olga resigned. And I thought this game was very instructional for a number of reasons, if we can just go back. And after knight c6, a4, fixing the weakness, of course, on b6. It's a typical idea. And here we can see black becomes passive, occupying, of course, the weak square in front of the backward pawn with a heavy piece. In this case, the queen. Lining up the heavy pieces against the backward pawn. And eventually the pawn falls. Advancing here, white's own weakness, getting rid of it. These positional and material advantages led to, of course, to an absolutely winning position. So thank you very, very much for taking the time to watch this video on backward pawns. Try and avoid them in your own games, and if you see them appearing in your opponent's position, or even better, if you can create them in your opponent's position, hopefully this video will be a little introduction on how to take care of that strategic advantage. So once again, I wish you well with your own chess, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care, and bye bye.